Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and this week we are going to talk about anorexia nervosa, and I'm excited to share with you a listener story because these are very powerful and impactful, and we always appreciate somebody who is willing to be vulnerable with us and share their story in this way because this is a very common problem in today's society. And so sharing your story like this, it can help somebody else. And not everybody is comfortable, and that's okay. It's really fine if you aren't comfortable sharing your story with the world. But for those who are, it helps somebody else feel less alone. So she is a friend of mine. We're going to call her Jane, as we usually refer to our female listeners who wish to be anonymous. And I met her through my cycling group. And so, she has recovered from her anorexia nervosa, but she's going to share her story. So I'm going to read this story verbatim, and then Mark and I are going to discuss it.
Okay.
All right. In order for me to fully explain my experience with anorexia nervosa, I feel as though it is only appropriate to start at the beginning of my journey, but I will also be making a long story short. I would like to address that I have also experienced anxiety since elementary school, although it went undiagnosed until I was diagnosed with my eating disorder as well. Up until 2020, I had never really struggled with the way I saw my body. I had been an athlete from 5th grade to 8th grade. I was a competitive swimmer, and as a swimmer, I was never worried about what I was eating. I simply ate because I needed to fuel my body. That's what eating was to me, simple. When my freshman year of high school started, I made the large decision to stop swimming and therefore stop being an athlete. The thing was, I was fine and happy with this decision, although I am uncertain if it had any effect on the way I saw my body. It is possible. I made it through most of my freshman year in the same way I had been living, content with my body and not worried about what I ate. My body was just my body and it was mine, so I was confident in it. Then something big happened that affected the entirety of the world, a global pandemic. Being locked inside with nothing to do and no way out can leave you stuck inside your own head, and that is exactly what happened to me. Although I do not blame my sister one bit, I started to see her grow interested in exercise and eating healthy, and I too wanted to do the same. Yet mine grew into an extreme, an obsession. My competitive relationship with my sister, competitive at the time, but I can now say she's one of my best friends, spurred my desire to eat healthy and exercise. But with each passing day, my obsession grew. A desire to exercise became a desire for intense exercise and a desire to completely change the way my body looks. A desire to eat healthy became an obsession with eating as little calories as possible. I began weighing myself obsessively every single morning, and eventually that turned into weighing myself multiple times a day. Eating became less frequent, and I continued to struggle even after lockdown ended and into my sophomore year. I got to a point of eating less than 1,000 calories a day and using MyFitnessPal to track every single calorie that entered my body. I even began to put in the calories of seasonings and spices. By January of my sophomore year, my parents knew something was wrong. I began refusing to eat. At this point, I had lost around 28 pounds. Being a 5'2" teenager with a smaller stature, I didn't quite have 28 pounds to lose. I fell into a depressive state, and I wasn't a person in which I am proud of. I was irritable, rude, tired all the time, and had absolutely no motivation anymore. I slept the days away and barely made it through a day of school. This was my breaking point. When I hit about 100 pounds, I decided I couldn't keep doing this. As much as my brain was telling me I had to, my heart was hurting so bad I knew I couldn't continue. My mom was the first person I reached out to, but being my mom who knows me so well, she knew. She picked up some signs, and since I told her early on that I had been struggling a little with body image, she began to slowly see it progress. I hid it as well as I could, so it did take a while for her to understand the extent of my struggle, and it made it harder for other people to see my struggle too. My mom and dad finally made the arrangement for me to an eating disorder clinic for outpatient care, as well as put me on Prozac to help me cope with my anxiety. I did not have high hopes going into outpatient care. I had been through counseling twice already at this point and did not experience any change from it, although I did not try, nor did I want to be helped at that time. Yet outpatient care was very helpful, and it made it so much easier that I was yearning to be helped. I didn't want to feel the way I was feeling anymore, and to be honest, I was so hungry and I wanted someone to give me a reason to eat. Now, that doesn't mean it was easy at all. The process was one of the most difficult things I've ever gone through. My clinic would weigh me every time I went in, and they started me coming in every week for personal care with a doctor. They would blind weigh me and do multiple tests to see how my body was functioning. I also met with a dietitian and counselor weekly, but that part was virtual. My dietitian was the most helpful part of this process. They had me progressively move up different meal plans and eating more calories so my body could slowly adjust. My parents also prepared all of my food. I would say for about 3 to 4 months, I did not prepare any food for myself. It was wonderful to not have to think about preparing food, which is quite terrifying for someone with an eating disorder. But at the same time, it was terrifying still due to having no control over what food I ate or how much my dietitian was like a counselor to me. She talked me through so many of my struggles with food and helped me to understand better why I had to eat, that I didn't have a choice if I ate or not. She's actually the reason I want to be a registered dietitian. I want to help people exactly how she helped me. My biggest coping mechanism was once exercise, and I actually began swimming in fifth grade to help with my anxiety. Yet in my time of recovery, I could not exercise. This was something my doctor would not allow because my body could not take it, and frankly, I had become addicted to exercise as well. In this time, I coped using a few different things instead. I did a lot of reading, which is something I've always loved, practiced lots of yoga, and got into stretching, talking to my friends and family, and my faith. My friends and family were my biggest support in this way. I talked to them about it a lot once I was comfortable telling people. My best friend was a huge coping mechanism for me, as well as my sister. They were huge supports to me, and this is when my sister and I finally became close. I do see this part of my story as a blessing. My sister and I became united, and she wanted to be there for me and help me more than anything. She would go out of her way to make sure I felt beautiful and loved. My faith was also a huge game changer for me. I am a Christian and have been my whole life, but this struggle, I decided to truly turn to God. I decided I had to understand that God had a plan for what I was going through. This struggle truly was a turning point in my faith journey, and it changed my view on what God was going to do with my life and how He was working. Today, I still practice many things to maintain my health and keep myself from relapse. I've been in recovery for about 2.5 years now, but I can say that I have experienced small relapses in this short time. I have learned from them, though. In order to keep myself in a healthy mindset, I know that I am not in a position where I can weigh myself and still maintain a healthy relationship with the scale. And I just know this fact about myself. The scale is something that really triggers me, and so I try to avoid it at all costs. When I go to the doctor, I have them weigh me blindly and I let them know. But I know as long as they tell me I am healthy, I do not need to know my weight. Seeing my weight completely shifts the way I view my body and always leads down a spiral and just aids in my body dysmorphia. I have just learned to avoid it. Another thing I do to maintain my health is to simply balance my diet. I know a lot about food at this point in my life, and from what I've experienced, I've come to know that I truly do love eating healthy and I love the way it makes me feel and how it energizes me. But I also know that I love to live and enjoy the amazing, not so healthy foods in life. It's all about balance. I know I can't eat unhealthy foods all the time, but I also know I can eat healthy and still enjoy the not quite healthy foods. But I also believe there shouldn't be good and bad foods. Food is food and your body will use it. There are just foods that are far more nutrient dense than others. Being a triathlete, I know that I have to feel myself correctly in order to perform well and be able to continue my sport. Food makes a huge difference in performance and can make a difference in being more prone to injury or not. As an athlete, I know I have to feel to do what I love, which is another point that I do to maintain my health. I practice a form of exercise that I truly love. I perform in a sport and am an athlete for a sport I am passionate about. I am so blessed to be healthy enough to do triathlons and move my body in a way that I love. I have also come to understand the importance of rest and recovery for our bodies. They need that too. Now, I find it is best that when I am feeling a certain way about my body or I am having feelings like I don't want to eat that, I have to talk to someone. My biggest support that I talk to now is my boyfriend of over 2 years. He does a great job of listening to me, validating my feelings, and redirecting my thoughts when I need that assistance. I am very blessed to have someone like him in my life who helps me, supports me, and loves me so much. I also have a couple very close friends that will always listen to me and help me, as well as my amazing parents and family. I would not have made it through recovery if I didn't have parents who pushed me but also made me feel so cared for. They wanted to help me so badly that they were willing to sacrifice anything for me, and for that I am forever grateful and thankful. They are the most generous people I know, and I am so lucky to have them. I would not be the person I am today, and I would not have made it this far if it weren't for them. So, this is a really incredible story. And again, thank you to Jane for sharing this story. So, Mark, what sticks out to you?
So I want to say at the start that I certainly appreciate her sharing her story. Eating disorders is certainly not something that I work with.
Hmm.
I think in all the years I've done this, I probably had 2 clients, and that was a long time ago. And I saw them in the context of a couple,
Mm-hmm.
and both females. Statistically, you're much more likely to have an eating disorder if you're a female. Although that's starting to change a
Yeah.
little bit with more males starting to have eating disorders. So I think that, what struck me is the similarities between this and addictions.
Mm.
Drug addictions, and some of the words are the same. She's in recovery and she relapsed and things like that. And I think that, when she talks about her faith, and the importance of faith in her recovery. If you think of any 12-step program, there's always a component of belief or in a higher being, whether you believe in God or not, but some sort of higher power. And so there are a lot of similarities in that. And I think that even hormonally, I would guess there's a huge component of that, like with dopamine, that
Mm.
starts out with, she talked about how it started out being competitive, I think,
Yeah. Yeah.
with her sister. But then I think it's the control. A lot of people who have eating disorders, it's really about the control. It's one of the few
Hmm.
things that you have absolute control of in this world is what goes into your body. And so I think over time it probably shifted to that. And that's probably one of the things that felt good to her. She was totally in control. The thing that stands out is the context of the pandemic. I thought was
Yes.
interesting to me because things are going along fine. She doesn't talk about her relationship with food before the pandemic or exercise. It almost seems like you get into the pandemic, you start the lockdown, she sees her sister, and that looks good to her, whatever it is her sister's doing. And
Hmm.
so for the pandemic, we talked about this probably our last episode or the one before, where it was so out of our control.
Yep.
It was scary. And so if you think about it from that perspective, it kind of makes sense. I mean, it's complex, the reason it starts, but this idea that this thing's going on we can't control, we don't really understand it. It's pretty
Hmm.
scary. But boy, if I focus on this, I can really direct my energy and attention to this particular thing, and I can be successful and I can control it. So that's a long answer to your question about what stood out to me.
The pandemic definitely jumped out at me too, and
Mhm.
she doesn't specifically say the pandemic triggered all of this. And so it was probably more subtle and more of a subconscious thing of, what I eat is something I can control. Nothing else in my life is in control, but I can sure control what I eat and I can control how much I exercise. I can control how many calories I burn and how much I consume. And in a world where everything feels crazy, I think this happened on a very subconscious level as a direct result of the pandemic. And so another thing that stood out to me is she recognized her triggers. And,
Yeah.
and that also is similar with addiction.
Addiction, yeah. You've got to
Yeah.
know what triggers are.
Yeah. And so I think that's really important in any recovery for addiction or an eating disorder. And, she did say that she became addicted to exercising. She
Mhm.
became obsessed. And so that is probably where the recovery stems from. Now, the thing is, I don't know that you can necessarily classify exercise as an addiction because it's something we need, but it is certainly something that you can take to an extreme like she did. And so she still exercises, but she's found a much healthier way to do it. And she's found a way to, feel her body and so that she can exercise. And she's found something that she loves and that she's passionate about.
Yeah, and so the similarities with addiction, there are a lot of them, and
Yeah.
that the trigger thing that stood out to me too. And so the reason that people develop eating disorders, I think
Hmm.
it's certainly complex,
Yeah.
but I think there are probably three main parts to this. One is there's certainly a cultural component to it. The message of thin is better. I think that, we get messages on media, social media, and on magazines, everything about exercise being really good. I mean, for you, the bodies of the people that are in those ads are always perfect bodies, right?
Yes. Uh,
Which perfect bodies typically don't exist.
yeah, I was gonna jump in there real quick and say, spoiler alert, those bodies in those ads that you see
They've
are
been
altered.
airbrushed.
Yeah,
Right.
yes, those bodies are almost always altered. So
Right.
it's not
Nowadays, that's probably an easy thing to do. Yeah.
AI is
Right.
so
And
easy.
so you've got this cultural component, this very strong message about thin is better and exercise is good. So that's one piece. Then you have the psychological piece. And I think that is, for instance, control issues. There's a strong correlation with sexual abuse and abuse in general with
Hmm.
eating disorders developed later. And so that I would class as a psychological issue. Controlling for females, it used to be having a controlling father
Hmm.
was a really controlling father because, again, it's one of the ways you can express control. So you have the psychological issues. And then the last one, which we've talked about before, there's always a physiological component. So the
Hmm.
nature versus nurture. And so the
Hmm.
nature part being, what we're born with, our genetic makeup and things like that. I think it's clear that really anything we talk about from a mental health perspective, there's always going to be that component. There's the
Hmm.
cultural component and the physiological component.
Right. And so just so we're clear here, that is a generality about
Right.
eating disorders. And my understanding from this story that we've talked about tonight is she doesn't have any history of abuse or control.
Right.
And
Right.
so
Good point.
yeah,
Yeah, I'm
and
not
so
saying she was abused. I'm just saying
yeah,
in general that those can be markers. Yeah.
but you can also develop them without that. But there was a type of psychological trauma that definitely could have caused the pandemic.
In the pandemic, right. And so I think in the moment, it's been 3 years or so since the
Yeah.
pandemic started, but I think, it'd be interesting to go to actually talk with her to talk about if she remembers, what it was like for her at the start of the pandemic. Because
Yeah.
did she say how old she would have been? Wasn't
She was
she in high school? And
Yeah, she was a freshman in high school when it likely hit the very end of her freshman year, and then that's when this problem started, and then it continued into her sophomore, and I think it was by the end of her sophomore year that she got to a point where she's like, "I can't do this anymore, I need
yeah.
help."
And so in our episode that we had a few episodes ago, where we talked about the lasting effects of the pandemic, we talked about high schoolers and that
Yeah,
group of students, who were in high school at the time of the pandemic, because that social interaction is so important
it
at that
really
time
is.
in life. And all of a sudden they're probably for a couple of years, they were out of the classroom. I think that's incredibly hard. And so,
Mhm.
there are all those factors, that come into play. Yeah. The
Yeah.
pandemic probably that's how she started. I mean,
Mhm.
that's when it started. And so it could certainly be that was the trigger.
Yeah, I think so. Another thing that really stood out to me is when she talked about going to therapy. So
Hmm.
she had tried therapy twice and it didn't help. And the reason being is she said she wasn't interested in being helped. So she didn't want it. And I think that is true for any type of therapy. If you're not willing, or if you can't help somebody who doesn't want to help themselves, the best therapist in the world can't help somebody who doesn't want to be helped. So it
Right.
didn't make a difference for her until she was ready to make that change, until she was ready to do something.
Right. And I think there's another component that is generally true for therapy, not
Mhm.
just eating disorder therapy, you have to have a therapist that you really click with.
That too.
And
Yes.
if you don't waste your time and money by
Yeah.
staying thinking it's going to change, because you ought to be able to tell that first or second session easily
Hmm.
if you're going to click or not. And so you really don't need to go longer than, 2 sessions to decide, yeah, it's going to work. And so another thing that stood out to me is the relationship with the dietitian.
Yes.
And it doesn't necessarily have to be a therapist, but she formed that strong connection with the dietitian who also had that particular knowledge around food. But the strength of the relationship that she had really stands out. And so I think for people who might be considering getting treatment, one, I would always find someone who has the experience. I don't know
Yes.
that going to, or like someone like me, I would, if someone said I want to come, to work on an eating disorder, I wouldn't see them because I'd want to refer them somewhere else to someone who really has that experience. So with that, and
Hmm.
then once you find someone, make sure you really click, like you
Yeah.
you have that connection, because that's going to be the important thing. And I think in her story, that relationship with the dietitian is pretty important.
It definitely was. And she talked about how her dietitian helped her gain a better understanding about food. I really
Mhm.
liked what she said about there shouldn't be good foods and bad foods. Food is just food and your body will use it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's all about building a healthy relationship with food. And that is what makes this so different from addiction. Is addiction is something that is not good for you and it is something that you can go without.
Hmm.
Whereas food is not something that you can go without. And so, I think it was really about her relationship with food that she needed help changing, and her dietitian was instrumental in that. And for her it was really that shift of food is a way for me to fuel my body to do something she loved. So as with addiction, another similarity here is she found something to replace it. She found a coping mechanism, and coping mechanisms are so important for both addiction and any sort of mental health disorder, particularly an eating disorder. You need a coping mechanism. Now, for her, she was able to find an exercise that she loved, and that works for her. But if you're going through something like this, you've got to have a good, solid coping mechanism. And the other thing that she mentioned that I think is really important to note is that she recognizes her trigger from the scale, but she also recognizes that her thoughts can start to go down that bad road. So she talks about having body dysmorphia, and certain thoughts will trigger her body dysmorphia, and she recognizes that, and she can talk to somebody. And, she's in a place where she doesn't necessarily have to talk to a therapist about it, but she can talk to her boyfriend or friends or family or somebody. And if it is bad, I am sure she could talk to a counselor. But I think that's another really important part of any sort of mental disorder is, having a community.
I think for people who are thinking about getting treatment, you really want a team. I mean,
Yeah.
whenever I've talked to other therapists who do this type of work, there's always this concept of a treatment team. It's not just that
Yeah.
particular therapist. And so you have, the therapist, you have the nutritional counseling or the dietitian. You often have medical monitoring, depending on
Hmm.
how serious the eating disorder is. And so I think it is that idea of a team. And again, it doesn't always necessarily have to be the professional people. You can assemble your support team. I mean, you
Yeah.
could call it that, and clearly her parents and her sister were part of that support team. In fact, that's another thing that stands out. She had a pretty good support team because she's talking
Hmm.
about her boyfriend, her sister, her parents, and I think there were other friends as well that were
Yeah.
in the support team. Before I forget this, I wanted to mention relationship with food.
Yeah.
There's a great book. It's called Intuitive Eating, and the author is Evelyn Tribole. Intuitive Eating. It's been around for a while, but I think most people really like it. So it really is about having a different relationship with food. So it's not a
Hmm.
diet, because I think that's important. That diets, well, diets don't work for any of us. They certainly don't work for people in recovery for eating disorders. So it's not a
Yeah.
diet. It's more about listening to your body, which I think she mentions, listening to your body. What is it that I'm needing right now? And then doing that.
Mhm.
Am I hungry? Am I not? Am I not hungry? A lot of people eat just because people are sitting down and having a meal and they may not be hungry. And I think part of intuitive eating is listening better
Yeah.
to what your body is saying. The other thing that stands out to me, a similarity with addiction, is that if you take something away, so, in terms of addiction, if you're taking the drug away or the alcohol away, you've got to replace it with something else. And so the same
Mhm.
thing, if you're taking away, the focus on food, the focus on exercise, you've got to replace it with healthier things like, getting into something. So yoga is like a meditative thing. And
Yeah.
so doing healthier things to help reduce the stress. Often triggers are really about stress in some way.
Yeah.
And so, to be aware, what is it that stresses me? What is it that triggers me? And then figure out how can I change that? So, one of the triggers was looking at a scale for her.
Mhm.
And so I think that, she doesn't get on the scale and then she doesn't know what her weight is, which is a pretty good way to cope with it. The
Mhm.
doctors know. But so coming up with things that help you avoid the triggers is going to be really important.
Yeah.
Balance. She used that
Mhm.
word balance. And, balance is so important in all aspects of our life.
Yes.
When I see couples, I see people who, are in some sort of distress, their life is almost always out of balance.
Mhm.
And so one of the things that I'm trying to help them do is to get back into balance. And that's what she needed to do with their relationship with food, with exercise, everything. It's interesting that she went to be a triathlete because that can be really taxing. But
Mhm.
apparently it's more controllable for her. So biking's part of that. Is that that's how you
Mhm.
met her? So biking, swimming,
Yeah.
and
Running.
running?
Yeah.
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 To find something that is competitive is probably
Mhm.
because she starts out again at the start. I'm a competitive person. I'm competing with my sister, and so she just shifted that to something that really is healthier. You
Yes.
know, being
Yeah.
competitive as a triathlete. So the model. I mean, using this as a model, she brings in a lot of these different aspects that lead to success
Mhm.
in recovery for a lot of things. So she got treatment,
Yeah.
wasn't necessarily with the therapist, but the dietitian, I think, really filled that role
Mhm.
in some ways. A support group, more balanced approach to food and exercise,
Yeah.
and figuring out what the triggers are
Mhm.
and then trying to avoid the trigger. She even talks about relapse, which often happens, with any type of addiction. And then you just get back on the plan. And so
Mhm.
relapse is likely going to happen.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and I think it's better to expect that and accept
Mhm.
it, and then just, regroup and start again. And that it sounds to me like that's what she has done. And she has a pretty healthy attitude about this. From her writing. I think she does.
And that was the impression I've got from talking to her as well, is she does have a really great outlook on this, and I really like what you said about expecting a relapse. And so one of the things that people commonly fall into is this all or nothing thinking of, "Well, I had a relapse, so I might as well just give up completely."
Right.
And I've heard somebody make comparisons like, "Well, I spilled some ketchup on my shirt, so I might as well just squirt the whole bottle now." Right?
Yeah, no one really ever does that. So you're right. That's pretty
Yeah, that's a good
good big
analysis. Or,
uh,
"Oh, I splashed some water on my shirt, so I might as well just douse
no,
my entire body with water." That
yeah,
that doesn't make any sense. And
no.
so it's the same idea. Just because you have a small relapse doesn't mean you have to completely go back to square one. And so another thing that I think is helpful here is this idea of shame versus guilt. And
Mhm. Yeah.
and there's a huge element of shame around eating disorders, and shame is not helpful, but guilt is helpful because guilt is your mind's way of saying, I'm not doing this right and I need to make a change. I need to do something different. And that is a very helpful part of any recovery.
Right. And I think what stood out to me too is she does not talk about shame. And so I think she avoided that
Which is
for
good.
whatever reason. It could have been her
Yeah.
upbringing, it could have been, the support of a family or friends, but she doesn't talk about that. And so I think that's really fortunate for her and probably led to, it's not an easy success, but it probably helped in her success is that she didn't
Yeah.
have to deal with the shame aspect. The way that shame typically is expressed is you don't talk about it to anyone. That's how you know, like if you're hiding this thing, and that doesn't come out to me at all in her narrative, is that it seemed pretty early on,
Yeah.
was pretty open with talking about it.
Right.
And so, with addictions and a lot with eating disorders, there's a lot of shame in that. And shame, the hard thing about shame in any mental health issue is it keeps the addiction going or it keeps the eating disorder going. It feeds it.
Yeah.
And so her willingness to be open about it was probably one of the things I'd say it was the most helpful.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And so, again, I think that's shame does not help, but guilt, if you can shift it from that external, I'm a bad person, I have a bad body, and so I
Yeah.
have to fix my body to I am making poor choices around my body. I am treating my body in a way that's not
Yeah.
healthy, but I
Yeah.
can change that. And
Yeah.
so it's a subtle difference, but it's such an important difference. It's internalizing it versus externalizing it.
Yes.
And, that's
Exactly.
that's critical. So, it's make it about your choice, not you.
Yeah.
Focus on
Right. Right.
I can make a better choice or I can make a different choice. It doesn't mean that, I have to pour the entire bottle of ketchup on myself because I got one squirt.
Right, I'm gonna remember that. So,
Yeah.
Jane, thank you for sharing this story, and I think for our listeners, you can really gain a lot from this as
Mhm.
far as some of the things to do that lead to success and
Yeah.
overcoming, an eating disorder, and so I'm grateful that she was willing to share it, but see, that goes back to the no shame thing,
Yeah.
she's willing to share this story, and so
Yeah.
that's important to open yourself up to sharing these hard things. And you're right that sharing this really helps other people know they're not alone, that
Mhm.
other people are struggling with this.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And if you are in a place where you're not comfortable sharing your story with the world, that doesn't necessarily equivalent to being ashamed. I
Right.
think there's
Right.
there's different comfort levels. So don't feel like you have to get to this point where you can, share this very raw, vulnerable story with everybody, but you need to be able to share it with someone.
Yeah. So there is treatment available out there. There are good therapists who work with this. But again, you need to click with the therapist.
Yes.
That is actually the most important thing in any therapy is that
Yeah.
have that connection.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, so next week we are going to get into cohabitation, which is different from the last time we talked about cohabitation, because the last time we talked about moving in with a family member. So this time we're going to talk about it with couples, when it
Yes.
works and when it doesn't work.
Yes.
So we
Okay.
will see you all next week.
Have a good week, everyone.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.